They tied her in mockery, but it was the silence that followed that bound them. Sister Naomi stood with Grace on the cathedral steps, her hands folded, voice calm as she prayed for peace during a local justice vigil. But it wasn't long before 2 officers, uniforms crisp, smiles crooked, stepped in with smirks and sarcastic praise. "Disturbing the peace, huh, sister?" one joked, while the other laughed and reached for the decorative red rope meant to guide foot traffic. Within seconds, she was bound to the pole in front of the church like some twisted sideshow, the crowd torn between nervous laughter and stunned silence. Naomi tried to explain, gently with dignity, but the cops waved her off, amused by their own cruelty. "What are you gonna do?" they sneered. "Pray us into trouble?" They thought they were having fun, until they found out who she was. Where are you watching from? If you've ever watched power go too far, this story is for you. Sister. Naomi Clark never sought recognition. At just 28, she had already become a quiet force of compassion in her community. A black nun known for serving those most forgotten, battered women, abandoned children, and the chronically homeless, who gathered near the city's margins. Where others offered prayers and promises, Naomi offered blankets, food, and the kind of presence that made people feel seen. Despite her youth, she carried herself with a grace beyond her years. Her face rarely made the news, though her impact rippled through alleyways and shelters alike. She preferred it that way, staying in the background while her older brother, Senator Elijah Clark, stood on national stages. Elijah was a civil rights powerhouse, a rising voice in the Senate who challenged injustice with fire and poise. Naomi was his opposite in style but not in strength. She didn't speak into microphones. She spoke into silence, and her silence had power. That power would be tested on the courthouse steps during what was supposed to be a peaceful charity event. Naomi had been invited to lead a short prayer and bless donated supplies headed to a local women's shelter. It was a small act of grace on city property, a space where faith, policy, and public service often brushed shoulders, but not everyone saw it that way. Officer Luke Mathers and Officer Greg Powell worked the beat under the courthouse's jurisdiction. Uniformed in black, badges flashing, they were known for their sarcasm and swagger more than professionalism. Greg liked to flex authority. Luke liked to push boundaries and laugh when no one else did. When they spotted Naomi standing with her rosary in hand, they saw something that didn't fit their world. A young black woman in religious attire standing on the steps with dignity they hadn't given her. That's all it took. As the officers approached with smirks and comments wrapped in mock politeness, Naomi's eyes shifted briefly to her phone. She didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice, but her thumb moved quietly across the screen, opening one saved contact. She pressed send on a message that read, "I may need you." It went to only one person, her brother Elijah. Then she slipped the phone back into her sleeve and met their eyes without flinching. Because even in that moment she believed that grace could still hold its ground. What she didn't know was that power had already begun moving in her direction, and what they didn't know was that it wasn't the nun who should be afraid. It was the men laughing at her. Naomi's voice was soft but unwavering as she stood at the base of the courthouse steps, leading a small group in prayer for justice and compassion. Her words were not political, not accusatory, just sincere. She spoke of mercy, of healing, of the forgotten souls society too often passed by. But the moment she mentioned the need for accountability in law enforcement, A sharp laugh cut through the gathering. Officer Luke Mathers, arms crossed and sunglasses gleaming, turned to his partner with a smirk. "Well, look at that," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The Holy Sister's got opinions now. Wonder if she prays that hard for cop killers." Naomi continued without flinching, though her voice tightened around the edges. "Officer." Greg Powell stepped forward, circling her slowly, eyes scanning her robe with exaggerated curiosity. "This some kind of costume?" he said. "Halloween came early, huh?" Another burst of laughter. "Nah, man," Luke added. "She's protesting. Peacefully, of course, disturbing the public in the name of God." His badge glinted as he stepped closer. "You're on government property, sister. Might want to save the sermon for your little church steps." Naomi took a breath and calmly turned to step away. "I'm finished," she said. "The event's over." But before she could descend the last step, Greg blocked her path. "Oh, come on, don't leave us hanging. You got everyone's attention." He reached for the red rope that had been used to section off the donation tables. Thick, ornamental, meant for guiding crowds. Luke caught on instantly. "Let's see how much faith she's got when the tables turn." In one swift motion, they wrapped the rope around her torso and cinched it to the metal pole that flanked the steps. Naomi didn't struggle. She stood tall, eyes forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of panic. The crowd that had gathered began to shift. Some pulled out their phones to record. A few chuckled nervously. Others turned away, too stunned, or too ashamed, to act. She wore a habit of peace, but they dressed her in mockery. The laughter swelled as the officers took a step back to admire their handiwork, high-fiving like frat boys. "How's that for a peaceful protest?" Luke snorted. "You're the first nun we've ever arrested without cuffs." Naomi's phone, which had slipped from her sleeve during the scuffle, buzzed against the stone. The screen lit up beneath the hem of her habit. One message blinked. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply closed her eyes and let the silence gather its weight, because she knew the rope around her wasn't the thing tightening. It was the clock. And the moment it hit 0, the men laughing would find out exactly who they had tied down. "Officer." Mathers leaned in close, his smirk curving with mock authority as he whispered loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "Nobody's coming to save you, sister." His breath was laced with arrogance, his voice confident that the small act of public humiliation he'd orchestrated would go unchallenged. Just another day of flexing unchecked power. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She simply stared straight ahead, the wind brushing against her veil like it was preparing to part the scene. Then the sound of engines broke through the air. Low, steady, deliberate. Black SUVs, government grade, turned the corner and rolled down the street like judgment-wearing wheels. The crowd parted instinctively. Suited men stepped out with earpieces and unshakable stares, carving a path through the stunned bystanders. And from the center vehicle stepped Senator Elijah Clark. He didn't need to announce who he was. The moment his shoes hit the pavement, the air itself shifted. He didn't look at the officers at first. He walked straight toward Naomi, his face carved in stone, not a single flicker of emotion betraying the storm inside him. Then he turned to the men who had tied his sister to a pole in broad daylight and said, with a voice like carved granite, "Untie her, now." The street fell dead silent. Officer Powell took an unconscious step back. Mathers opened his mouth, but no words came out. They hadn't prepared for this. They hadn't prepared for the moment their joke would be met by something more powerful than outrage, by presence. "He didn't bring noise," the woman filming whispered, barely audible. "He brought a reckoning." When neither officer moved, Elijah didn't repeat himself. He simply stepped forward and began untying the rope himself, each tug unweaving. Not just the cord, but the illusion that their power was untouchable. Naomi stood still, not broken, not bitter, just radiant in her silence, her strength amplified by the brother who now untied her, not because she couldn't, but because he could. When the last loop fell to the ground, Elijah turned to the officers. "You tied a U.S. Senator's sister to a pole. For fun." His voice wasn't raised, but the weight behind it was thunderous. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A teenage boy dropped his phone in shock. The woman from the neighborhood gasped, clutching her chest. Even the laughter that once echoed now sounded like a curse someone was ashamed to remember. Officer Mathers stammered, reaching for an explanation. That didn't exist. But Elijah didn't wait for it. He stepped beside his sister, placed a hand gently on her back, and nodded to the security agents who had quietly flanked the area. The agents didn't speak either. They didn't have to, because in that moment, power had not just shifted. It had revealed itself. Not in fists, not in force, but in a man who arrived when the world doubted he would, and a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't need to. Standing beside her brother, robe slightly creased from the ropes, eyes steady, she let her silence speak volumes. Cameras flashed, phones recorded. Her composure, unshaken, unbothered, was more powerful than any sermon she could have delivered. She didn't flinch when Officer Mathers tried to explain. She didn't look away when reporters shouted questions. She just stood tall, her brother at her side, the city behind them watching with held breath. Within an hour, the video had spread like wildfire. A minute-long clip shot from a neighbor's phone, showing two laughing white officers tying a black nun to a public pole, cut to the moment Senator Elijah Clark emerged like judgment personified. The headline wrote itself, "Nun tied up by laughing officers, turns out she's Senator's sister." By the end of the day, it had gone international. Civil rights leaders called emergency press briefings. Prominent pastors, imams, rabbis, and humanists released joint statements denouncing the act as both racially and religiously targeted humiliation. Hashtags like Naashiu, Sister Naomi, and Chirdihak, She Stood, still flooded timelines. But more than outrage, there was awe. At the way she had stood, at the way she had endured. The woman they mocked became the symbol they couldn't erase. Then came the second blow. Officer Mathers' body cam footage leaked, not just from that day, but previous stops. Video after video revealed a pattern of abusive behavior, racially charged taunts, unnecessary force, all buried under routine paperwork. He had laughed his way through years of misconduct, protected by silence. But Naomi's silence had cracked something deeper. Internal affairs could no longer ignore what had been exposed. A formal review was launched. Public, not internal. Officer Powell was suspended. Mathers, under fire from multiple directions, had already lawyered up, but the narrative was no longer theirs to twist. Days later, Senator Clark stood before Congress. His voice, calm but sharpened by grief, echoed through the chamber. "No faith is sacred," he said, "if we ignore the humanity within it. You can't claim to serve the people if you can't recognize the dignity in a black woman wearing a veil." There was no applause, just a pause, heavy, humbling. He continued, "My sister didn't ask for justice. She became the mirror that revealed how far we still are from it." And as those words entered public record, Naomi's silence was no longer a wound. It was a movement. Justice came, not with noise, not with riots, but with consequence. Both Officer Luke Mathers and Officer Greg Powell were terminated from the department within a week of the investigation. Their names, once shielded by authority, became synonymous with disgrace. The footage, the statements, and the public outrage had made their actions impossible to ignore. But even as reporters chased after headlines and politicians scrambled to align themselves with the right side of history, Naomi Clark remained who she had always been. Quiet, grounded, focused not on revenge, but on healing, a formal public apology was issued by the city's police chief, broadcast live with trembling hands and rehearsed sorrow. Naomi didn't attend. Instead, she was back at the shelter that morning, folding blankets and organizing donations. Her presence had never been for cameras. Her service didn't require applause, and yet the nation had come to know her name. Not because she shouted it, but because she refused to let it be erased. Moved by the incident, Senator Elijah Clark introduced legislation before Congress just 2 weeks later. The bill, known as the Naomi Act, aimed to outlaw religious-targeted harassment by law enforcement, mandating stricter accountability for abuse of power during peaceful religious demonstrations. It included required bias training, independent review panels, and the creation of a national public misconduct registry for officers with repeat offenses. The bill passed its first round with overwhelming support, not because of partisan pressure, but because no one could unsee the image of a nun tied to a pole, stoic and still, as the world laughed around her. She didn't preach with a microphone, Elijah told the press. She preached by standing still. Back in her city, change took root in quieter ways. The courthouse where Naomi had once been tied became the site of a new community tradition. Every year, on the anniversary of the incident, a silent prayer march was held, led by Sister Naomi herself. She would walk at the front, her hands clasped, surrounded by children, clergy, activists, and neighbors who now recognized the power they once ignored. They stopped at the exact spot where she had been humiliated, and there, embedded into the stone, was a bronze plaque engraved with her likeness and a single inscription. In her silence, we heard what justice had forgotten. The red rope had long since been removed, but in its place stood a flowering vine, gently woven along the pole, blooming in the colors of peace, white, violet, and soft gold. What once symbolized shame now stood reclaimed, transformed by a woman who never needed to fight back to win. Naomi returned to her daily work without fanfare. She still walked the same streets, visited the same homes, comforted the same broken hearts. But now, people stopped her, not just to thank her, but to listen. And though she spoke little, every word she did offer carried weight. She had never asked for justice, but she had become its reflection. And through her, the world remembered that dignity doesn't shout, it stands. And standing, it transforms everything around it. She was never powerless. They just didn't expect power to wear a veil. Sister Naomi Clark didn't need to raise her voice or demand justice with clenched fists. She stood still, anchored in faith and quiet conviction, and let the world expose itself around her. In doing so, she didn't just change the trajectory of a moment, she shifted a system. The officers who mocked her are now a footnote in a story that belongs to her. The rope meant to humiliate became the symbol of resilience. And the silence they expected to be submission? It became a thunderous echo across a nation. Have you ever been disrespected for staying silent when others mocked you? Has your grace ever been mistaken for weakness? Share this if you believe. Dignity doesn't need volume to echo. Drop your city in the comments and follow for more stories where justice dresses in silence. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stand tall even when you're tied down.